welcome sincerely, and over to you.
You're more than welcome. Sue's got a presentation. Are you able to share that?
Let me just get that up now. Won't be a sec.
So it won't be a surprise to you that I'm going to talk about what happened at Rochdale, and then the lessons that we learn and some key takeaways that I would say would be quite useful for all of you that are now getting ready for the introduction of Awaab's law. So how do we do this from the start? I can't click, you'll have to click.
Yes, I'm just trying to get full screen. Okay.
So for those that don't know, I was brought into Rochdale Borough-wide housing after the coroner's verdict. So I went straight in to try and calm the waters and just kind of look at what lessons and to get them on the road to recovery. So this all started, and you will all remember these pictures that came about, which were on the news. They were everywhere. And I can remember sitting at home watching this, thinking, this is just really awful, but also really feeling for the organisation, because nobody wants this to happen. And you kind of knew that it was not in a very good place. So when I got the call to see if I would go up there, in fact, there wasn't any hesitation because I knew somebody had to do it. So my history, just to say, so I've been in the sector for over 30 years. I've worked at Family Mosaic, originally New Islington and Hackney, Family Mosaic, East Thames housing. So predominantly the whole of my career was in London. And then I took East Thames into a merger with L&Q and thought I'd retire. And I was only off for a few months before I got my first call to come back and try and help out an organisation. So I know London very well, and I did not know Rochdale at all. So I didn't even know where it was when I was asked to go up there. So if we just move on. So Awaab actually died in December of 2020, but none of you would have heard of that. So it was, a tragic death that occurred within a property that was run by Rochdale Borough-wide Housing. It was seen as a very sad event, but it didn't go any wider than that. And then we had the coroner's court, which started in the summer of 2022. And that's when the news started to get out that there could be a link between this baby dying and damp and mould in his home. And then the coroner's verdict was announced in November 2022. And that's when it absolutely went crazy. So next slide. So the coroner's verdict wasn't just about RBH. It was also about a lot of things that had kind of gone wrong in Awaab's case. So they talked about a breakdown in communication between statutory organisations, the GP, health visitors, midwives, hospitals and housing. So that kind of lack of really good joint working. Language barriers resulting in a lack of understanding, and I'll talk a bit more about that. She talked about outdated HHSR guidance, and obviously we know we've got Decent Homes 2 out of consultation at the moment, and there was misguided legal practices in disrepair at RBH. For the next slide. And the world had to listen for the first time to the link of his death to prolonged exposure to damp and mould in his home. And this was the first time that it had been specifically linked. So the cause of death, this is, the first one basically meant he had swelling in all of his airways. And she actually stated very clearly that it was caused by the damp and mould. Next slide. And that's when there was absolute chaos. I would say I've never seen media intensity that there was over this case. These are some of the headlines that came out. It was over every news station. It was over all of the kind of papers. And I think the last one on here is what was really the key thing, that it was a defining moment for the sector. And the coroner stated that, and I don't think any of us could deny that that was the case. So next slide. So what had happened, and a lot of people don't know the full story of what had happened with Awaab and his family. So just to give you that background, Awaab had moved with his family from Sudan. They were refugees. They lived on the freehold estate, which is a picture on the right. They lived in a one-bedroom flat on that estate in Rochdale. Now, Awaab's father started to report damp and mould quite early in their tenancy. And what he heard was wash it down and paint over it. That's not what was said, but English wasn't his first language, and that was what he'd heard. So he washed it down and he painted over it, and it came back, and he washed it down and he painted over it, and it came back. And then it started spreading throughout the property. So he started then reporting in frequently to the organisation. Again and again, he said that his son was having problems with his breathing. He'd had numerous hospital admissions, A&E visits, but it was being treated by the organisation as a routine repair. And I think, to be fair, at that time, most organisations treated it as a routine repair. His father then, in a kind of despair, put in a disrepair claim. They have a lot of claim miners up in Rochdale. Somebody had knocked on his door, so he put in a disrepair claim. And Rochdale at the time had a policy, which I'd never seen anywhere else, was that if a claim came in, they stopped all work. They did nothing until the claim was settled. So basically, the mould just got worse and worse. That property had been visited by surveyors, repairs staff, housing officers. They'd seen what it looked like, and no one had raised a safeguarding alert. So on the day of Awaab's death, his breathing had got worse. His parents took him to Rochdale A&E. They blue lighted him over to Oldham, which had more specialist facilities. They stabilised him. He was discharged with the message to his family to bring him back if he got worse. But again, that was lost in translation. And so when Awaab then became worse, they took him back to Rochdale rather than taking him straight to Oldham. And when he got to Rochdale, they blue lighted him across to Oldham, and he died in the ambulance on the way. So it was an absolutely tragic case of lots of missed opportunities, is what I would say. Next slide. So when the coroner's court had been going, there'd been a reporter from the MEN, junior reporter from the Manchester Evening News, for those that don't know, who don't know that up north. And what he'd done, he'd gone around and he'd door knocked on the freehold estate and just said, have you got any issues? And he found repeated complaints of damp and mould across that estate. RBH had not looked. And it was only at that point, once it was published, that they then started to look, and they carried out inspections into all the properties on the freehold estate, and they found that 80% of them had damp and mould. But none of the dots had been joined up over the years with just repairs calls coming in. Next slide. So you'll probably all recall what happened next at RBH. So they were downgraded by the regulator to a G3. There was breach of 2 consumer standards. The Secretary of State stepped in at the time, embargoed all development funding. The Ombudsman stepped in to do a Para 49 special investigation into systemic failings. And there was a complete change in leadership and governance. So the chief exec was asked to leave, and all of the board agreed to step down. Clearly, we didn't need the whole board stepping down at the same time, so we did do that in a kind of staged way. But they did take responsibility and they did agree to go. Next slide. So what we knew, so RBH had been formed following a stock transfer. 12,000 homes came across from the council. They had a lot of brick-built homes that were over 70 years old, a lot of red brick. Rochdale is a very wet climate. For anyone that's never been up there, like me, I couldn't believe just how often it rains. And it rains a lot, so it is a really damp climate. It's a very diverse borough. English is not always their first language, and they have a lot of multi-generational living and overcrowding. And that sounds very familiar to London and a lot of places in London. So we have a lot of stock like this in London. We have a lot of brick-built homes that are over 70 years old. We do have a problem with overcrowding. And so you can just see that the kind of the things that impact on damp and mould we've got across London, so we have to take it seriously. Next. So I got there and I just, with a bit of curiosity, I was thinking, is it just this estate? How do we know? If we didn't know this was going on there, how do we know? And so I did a call out to tenants. I basically said, if you've got a problem, let me know. And they certainly did. Next slide. So the call out to residents led to 1,800 cases being reported within 2 weeks. It was like an avalanche. And, you know, I was just kind of like, what on earth am I going to do with this? I've asked the question, but clearly, what are we going to do? So it was about listening, and I went out and visited a lot of people, starting to rebuild trust. I met with the residents, councillors, staff, the mayor, media, the Secretary of State, and we set up a damp and mould task force because the volume of damp and mould across their estates was so huge. We set up a new KPI tracking system so that we could actually track those cases to make sure we were responding to them, they were being followed through. And we didn't just go out and treat the damp and mould. We started investigating what was the cause of the damp and mould, because too often, I think, when it was being treated as a routine repair, it would come in, we would send someone down, they would treat it, we would go away. And when we started doing those investigations, we found lots of issues around water ingress because balconies had moved slightly away from the building, damp courses that were failing, really poor ventilation in a lot of the properties. So it wasn't a lifestyle thing. It was purely around the condition of those properties. And then we commissioned a whole kind of lessons learned audit. Next slide. And there were a lot of lessons that were learned. So the organisation, not unlike many, had been very focused on new homes, on the development of new homes, and this real push from, we've had a government, successive governments pushing us to build more and more homes because we know we need them. But that has been at the detriment to our existing properties where the focus has been taken off of those. Damp and mould was seen as a routine repair, as I've said, and there was no linking it to health, vulnerability, or no consideration of temporary decants. I think one of my most disappointing and one of my big questions was, why did nobody say these people can't live here? Why did the housing officer not feel that she could actually move them into temporary accommodation? And data wasn't being used to inform the investment decisions that were being made. So everything was seen in isolation. They had stock condition surveys that showed 98% decent homes. So they didn't think they had a problem. Complaints that were being reported as a percentage responded to within timescale. They weren't looking at what the complaints were about. They would just say, are we meeting the timescale to respond to that complaint? And disrepair was being reported as a cost. So what was the legal cost of disrepair? It wasn't, what are these cases that are constantly coming through? So when we then triangulated that data, it screamed damp and mould. So had they been joining the dots and not all working in isolation, they would have seen that they had a major issue with damp and mould. Next slide. We also learned that a lot of this was culture. There'd been a move away from core landlord services. We'd obviously been through COVID. People were used to working from home more. They weren't visiting their residents as much as they used to. So the tenant contact had really dropped. And there was a kind of lack of empathy. It was seen as very normal. You know, we have a bit of damp and mould, not realising the impact that was having on the way that people were living their lives, or the ultimate impact for poor Awaab, who died at the age of 2. They'd made assumptions about cultural behaviours. So a surveyor had gone in to the property and he'd noticed there was a bucket in the bathroom. And instead of asking what the bucket was for, he'd assumed that this was part of ritual bathing, and so that they'd been splashing water all over the bathroom floors and that had been the cause of damp and mould. That wasn't the case at all. So they'd kind of made an assumption. It was around lifestyle, and there was this blaming of lifestyle. They were in a 1-bedroom flat. There was only a family of 3 at that time. The mum was pregnant. So you wouldn't have said they were massively overcrowded. However, they had a huge amount of stuff in that property. And again, nobody had really been looking to see what the impact of overcrowding was having on the home. There was inadequate intelligence about people and their homes, and he had a lot of disempowered staff. And one of the things that I talk about when I do these talks is around, are you getting in the way of your staff making really good decisions? So our staff too concentrating on policies and procedures to have stopped saying and arguing the case when they believe that residents are living in conditions that they shouldn't be living in. So it was about how do we empower our staff to make the right decisions when they go into people's homes. Next slide. There was obviously an issue with IT and systems, isn't there always? So as I said, there were too many standalone systems. They weren't joined up. They weren't picking up kind of themes that were going through in this case. So there was no single view of the customer or the property. There were repeat calls from Awaab's father and they hadn't been linked. And as part of the lessons learned, we listened to those recordings and you could hear him getting more and more desperate as he phoned into the organisation. But because it was a different operative that answered every time, that wasn't looking back on what had previously happened, nobody was picking up that he was getting more and more distressed. There was no clear system for sharing with health and vice versa. So health were criticised quite significantly in this case. And that was because, you know, they were seeing him more and more frequently and they weren't contacting housing to see what they were doing about it. There was poor and inconsistent record keeping. So when we were trying to track exactly what was happened, it was really quite difficult. And there was a sense in the kind of contact centre of handing things off as quickly as they could. So it was, you know, they were being monitored on how quickly they wrapped up a call. And in this case, that meant that they were just throwing through a repair request every time. And the data, accuracy of data was a big issue, the integrity and the lack of use of it. And data, as you will all know, is the new big buzzword with the regulator. So they are really, really keen on how we use data. And part of that has come from what happened with Awaab. Part of the other thing that has come from what happened with Awaab is that the regulator was given a very hard time about this case. And so everyone's inspections are much tougher than they ever were before. Next slide. So race and culture, and this came out in the media as well. They were calling RBH racist. Use of language was one of the key things that clearly came out in the lessons, and actually having to check that people are understanding what you're saying, because you think you've told them, but if they don't understand what you're saying, then it's of no use. They branded RBH racist. I don't believe they were. They actually treated everyone as badly as they did. It was just a kind of culture thing that went on. Understanding vulnerabilities and trauma, particularly around refugees, there was a real lack of understanding of how difference in lifestyle, difference in even climate for people that are moving from very hot countries. They've never encountered damp and mold before. They wouldn't know what to do with it. There was no professional curiosity. So staff weren't curious about what's going on here. What can we do? They weren't raising the questions. And as I said before, there was no profiling cases. So they weren't looking at triangulating all of information that we had on somebody. Next slide. So the road to recovery was quite a long one for Rochdale, and it was about getting back to the core business of being a great landlord. They did stop all development and focused on investment in existing homes. They set up a corporate plan to do that for 5 years. A new set of organisation values to underpin and change that culture was put in place. Being really clear on what we'll do and what we won't do. It was a bit wishy-washy at times. Really engaging with customers and stakeholders openly. And I spent a lot of time out with customers and with stakeholders saying what's good about the organisation, what's not so good. And that's where you really learn, and you'll get themes coming through from those conversations. Really about keeping our promises. So if we said we're going to do something, do it. And then empowering the staff. So there was a big culture shift around empowering staff to do the right thing. Next slide. So preparing for Awaab's law, obviously we started preparation for this much sooner than most people. When I was there, the Secretary of State came and met with Awaab's parents, and that was when he promised to bring in Awaab's law. So we started doing a lot of work early on. One of the big issues was knowing that we were going to have a huge volume of work coming our way with this, and you all will as well. And so it was about addressing a repairs backlog, because otherwise things just get lost within that. We set out a new policy to ensure that all hazards were effectively identified. We set up a new end-to-end repairs process to ensure that hazards were responded to and followed up. We streamlined our approach to repairs delivery and capability to flex resources. So we initially had a massive damp and mould task force, and then it reached a point where we'd kind of got on top of a lot of the work that it needed to go back into our usual repairs service, but with the ability to flex. So when we when we had this massive influx, you know, we pulled people from our plastering teams, you know, people from all different teams, from our cleaning teams, estate services, to help with that. But then they were able to go back to their original jobs. Management of data, really important. And at Rochdale, they did bring in a head of data management and trained a range of colleagues on the kind of hazards and damp and mould, so that anyone going into a home for any reason, be it a housing officer, be it a repairs operative, they would look around and ask the question if they had any issues with damp and mould. And it empowered staff to step in. So next slide. So there were kind of key takeaways, and the reason that I was quite happy to do this, one of the commitments that we gave to the coroner is that we would share the lessons learned across the sector. And both myself, Amanda, who's the permanent CEO there now, and Nadia, who's the Director of Operations, do these quite a lot. So, but the key takeaways that I think are for people is check other properties in a block. Don't just assume that you've got an isolated property in a block that has damp and mould. Be proactive about that. We did heat mapping all reports of damp and mould across all of our estates, and you could see where there were major issues because you had really red spots on some estates. And so we could then do more investigation work. And I would urge you to do that. Having a really proactive approach for overcrowded homes. That doesn't mean that you're suddenly going to have homes to move people into, because you're just not. We know that. There's a lack of large properties in London. But this was about checking in on those families that you know are overcrowded regularly, and just saying any issues, any signs of damp and mould, because that's where you're going to get the most problems. And then we make sure that we do a 6-month and a 12-month follow-up. It can be a call. Have you got any issues? Don't wait for them to come back to you. Actually be proactive about seeing if it's repaired, because damp and mould we are never going to get rid of completely anywhere in this country, and there are always going to be issues of it. So we should take a much more proactive approach. Empower your frontline to resolve issues. Really give them the opportunity to say, I can't leave this family living here, we have to do something. It's not a lifestyle issue. Nobody chooses to live in damp and mould conditions. And make sure that you triangulate the data that you've got. Next slide. Choose questions. So I'm happy to answer anything about the time around Awaab's death or the things that were done after.
Thank you very much.
It does stun people into silence.
Yeah, it does. I think it certainly pauses moments of reflection, doesn't it? Because you're thinking about all of the consequence of what you've gone through and what needs to be done.
I mean, Awaab's, sorry, just to say, Awaab's family, they went on to have 2 daughters, but their never-ending sadness is that they will never know their brother.
Yeah, it makes it all very, very real, doesn't it? Yeah. Immense, Yvonne, thank you. Questions. I'll just get us going with a couple, Yvonne, and then please, colleagues, just put your hand up and we'll invite you in. We've got a good 15 minutes, so we will invite you in. In terms of the That's the challenge, obviously, preparing for damp and mold is a considerable resource and financial challenge. How have you approached that as an organisation to ensuring, as if you will, demanding as that's going to be, that it happens?
So at Rochdale, I can tell you in that first year after the coroner, they spent over £1 million just on damp and mould. And that wasn't £1 million that they just had sitting in a drawer somewhere. So they did have to look at what they were going to turn off so that they did that. And that was about delaying some of their investment works elsewhere. And it was also stopping their development programme. So this was seen as it would be the key priority. And so that's what they did, basically.
Thank you, Yvonne. Neil.
Thanks, Dermot. Thanks, Yvonne. So I missed the first few minutes. My apologies. But what I did hear is really insightful. Thank you. Thank you for that. You mentioned sort of culture quite a bit, and we do know that culture of the organisation, culture that we sort of empower frontline staff with, is really important. What sort of I mean, we talk about it a lot. Have you got any insight into what you've actually done, particularly sort of empowering and changing views of frontline staff, housing officers, and what have you?
So yeah, I can. So we put every staff member, and this was another big investment, through a customer first training program. That was everyone. It was everyone, even in the office. It was our repairs. It was our housing staff, which was to really understand what it means to think about your customer first rather than anything else at all. And we used a company called Accelerator Solutions to do that, and I've used them a few times. But I held a number of frequent roadshows. So I went out and met with those staff teams frequently and talked to them about the fact that we were giving them permission to do things. And I think you have to be as overt as that. You can't just go, well, of course we empower our staff. If you're not telling them clearly that you're empowering them to do that and that they have the ability to do things when they need to, then they're just not going to have the confidence to do it. I will say the staff there were great. They had a really good staff team who had been devastated by what had happened. They grabbed that power, with both hands and really took it to improve the services that they were providing. They held many more surgeries out on estates. They do walkabout days frequently with some of the senior managers to really have a look and talk to residents as they're going around. So I do think it's a mix of you telling them and giving them the opportunity to do that. And just being clear that policies and procedures are there, but are in place for a reason. But there are times when they need to escalate things and that you're happy for them to do that. What you don't want is any of your managers turning around and saying, well, that's not in the policy.
Thanks, Yvonne.
Thank you. Questions from colleagues? Any other question? While people are reflecting, Yvonne, can I ask about data? As you rightly say, it's seen as the big thing. And you've got multiple line of business applications, and trying to make sense of it is a bit of a challenge. So question in terms of, one, how have Rochdale, with the new head of, pieced that all together? And any early insight into how data is going to be used against monitoring performance against the new statutory deadlines?
Yeah, so not just there, but where I'm working now as well, because obviously I know a bit about damp and mould. It's always at the forefront wherever I go, anywhere. So I have to say, you do need somebody. You need a data person who's actually going to pull all of that information together. You need to think about what are your sources, and making sure that the information that you have on your residents is as up to date as it possibly can be. So we went through a big tenancy audit push to make sure that we had vulnerabilities, we had any special characteristics, everything on our system, so that we knew what it was that was going on in those households. You can't, you never get it 100% accurate, but the best that you can. We started to regularly triangulate data. And we did that as a kind of exec team where we were looking at what were the themes coming through from complaints, what was coming through in disrepair claims, what was our stock conditions telling us, what was our repairs history telling us, and actually looking at and deep diving into it. And our board, we've done deep dives to the board. So we've done presentations to show them that we're pulling all of this data in. So you need to think about what data sets you currently hold and which of those could link to a certain thing. And certainly in terms of damp and mold, you've got loads of information about your stock. One of the things that I always say to people is the amount of information that we have as housing providers, Tesco's would kill for. We have a lot of data and we don't actually use it. So we collect it and it sits there. So it is about how do you pull that out of systems so that you can actually look at that in the round rather than, I'm looking at the stock condition data, which is telling me that we're fine. As I said, their stock condition data at that time said they had 98% compliance. And they clearly damp and mold wasn't one of the things that they were checking for. So I think getting prepared on the use of data, we set in place really clear key performance indicators to track our damp and mold cases. And then they were reviewed at senior management team on a monthly basis. So that is how many have come in, how many have we responded to, how many have been assessed as high risk, how many have been responded to within 48 hours, what have we done about that, and literally tracked that and did trend analysis on it. The other thing that helps you to do is work out actually what level of workforce you need.
And then more specifically, Yvonne, anything, have you done anything specifically around the having to codify the new targets into an IT system, or is that part of that KPI?
Yeah, that's new. That was watched now. So we're just now where I am at the moment. We're just setting that all up in the same kind of levels that you probably all are. So we have a number of technical officers who are expected to go out within 24 hours of a report. And they're the ones that will kind of assess it at what level it's at, and then they will be the ones that input into the system.
Great, thank you, Yvonne. Jay?
It's an expensive business.
It certainly is.
Yeah.
Jay?
Just to touch on the data, and obviously I'm going to talk about data in a minute as well, but it was really interesting to hear you talk about that it was felt that there was probably sufficient information in the complaints and repairs history to start to understand where there might have been risk.
Yeah.
And that, everyone's got that, right? So it feels like there are some really kind of useful data sets that just need to be analysed in the right way to start giving you an indication and helping you build a bit of a strategy and a plan for where you might want to start focusing. I wondered if through the work that's been happening at Rochdale, if there have been specific kind of analytical approaches that have been developed, which then might be able to be shared with other organisations as they sort of put these data capabilities into place.
Yeah, I mean, I can certainly get them to send some information over to Sue, and then she can share it around.
Yeah, it might just be interesting actually at that level of the kind of the data people to start connecting and sharing. And we do a lot of work in Lottie world of connecting data scientists and data leaders, because there is that kind of specific interface of things which, if you've analysed it this way, that is transferable. So it's probably
I think the other thing is that we were all of us were driven a lot by what the regulator wanted to check at that time, which was, are you responding to complaints and the ombudsman? Have you met your target for responding to stage 1 and responding to stage 2? So our kind of data sets were linked in with what they were asking of us at the time. But what we've not done is stepped back and thought about, well, that's fine, we've answered it, but what was it about? So I do think, certainly at a management and director level, knowing that they have responded in time is one thing, but actually knowing what people are complaining about is what's more important. So I think, some of the regulatory standards and the ombudsman drive us to look at certain data sets. And I think it's for us to think about, well, that's fine, but what else is important? What's going to be more useful to us as kind of management teams?
Yeah, I think that's...
Thank you. Peter?
Yeah, hi, thank you. Hi, Yvonne. Just
Right.
just a quick question. Sorry, I'm from the Barnet Group, and just listen to what you were just saying about sending technical officers out within 24 hours.
Yeah.
So I take it you're taking the approach that you're having somebody go out to assess, is this an urgent, regardless of what comes in, that they're sort of triaging it for you.
They do, they triage. So our contact centre will ask questions and they'll try to get a kind of early diagnosis. Is it in more than one room? How large is it? You know, the usual things that you would expect them to do. But we're quite fortunate because we are estate based. We've got local offices. I mean, some of you probably still have. That it's actually, you know, within walking distance to go out and have a look at those properties.
Okay.
So it's easier for, certainly at Rochdale it was easier, and where I am now it was easier.
Yeah, okay. It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because obviously you've got the 10 days to do the inspection, and we've got a lot of out of borough properties as well, as I'm sure other people have acquisitions and things that are not quite that easy. But yeah, equally important. And the other question, it might maybe for everybody rather than just for you, is what are people doing about the 24 hours? So say for example you see something on a Friday that you need a 24-hour response. Does that, I know we're waiting for confirmation, but what are people planning on doing about the weekends?
So the other thing as well to take into account is not all of your residents will let you in within 24 hours. So that was one of the things that we learned at Rochdale, so that we could, you know, have the best will in the world of going, right, we're sending people straight out, they're doing the assessment, we're going to get them straight out to do some treatment. And then residents would say, well, I'm out tomorrow, you can't come in tomorrow, because, and I think it's understanding that they've lived with it for quite a long time. So the urgency is not with them, it's with us because of Awaab's law. Yeah. So, and we have had those conversations back to government around, look, you know, you can say that, but if they won't let us in, and I just think as long as you keep a really, really clear record of that, then it's not deemed as a failure, because you can't kick the door down to go in and do it.
Yeah, of course. But in terms of remediation, so, you know, one of your technical officers goes out, or one of the surveyors goes out and sees a severe case of mould on a Friday.
Yeah.
Are you then sending somebody on a Saturday to remedy that?
Yeah.
Is that what other people are doing? I mean, yeah, it's just a general question, because obviously we need to gear up for that if that's the expectation.
The other thing that you'll find as well is even by empowering your staff to offer temporary accommodation where you think they're in a high risk property doesn't mean they'll accept it.
Yeah.
So record keeping is absolutely key.
Yeah. Lovely. Thanks very much.
Just on that one, Peter, just looking at the note from Matthew Pennycook, it talks about it does say, although typically it says working days, but 24 hours is indeed, it's like 24 hours of working days on the emergency one. So yes, that is a question. Michael.
Yeah, hi everyone. Firstly, my humble apologies, particularly to Hannah, for organising and then turning up late. I feel quite bad about that. So I'm sorry I missed the presentation. You may have covered some of this, and it might be a specific question for you, or might be more generally. But one of the things I'm quite interested in is when it comes to remedial work. So you've done your inspection, you've decided some work needs done. I'm interested what you'll have done or what others are doing in terms of applying target dates to the work. And from a repairs background, I'm quite used to, you know, a fence needs doing, it's got a 20-day order. It's got a 40. But I didn't see any specific guidelines around this thing. But so I'm interested in what other people are doing in terms of there's a piece of work, how they're deciding to put a target date or a period on that. So I hope that makes sense.
Certainly at Rochdale, so on the freehold estate, obviously there was a major issue there. And after the investigation, they realised that it needed complete new ventilation systems into every property.
Yeah.
And that was another £1 million spend that was going into just one block. They couldn't have got all of that done in a short period of time. So there was a programme which was basically based on when the contract could complete, how quickly the contractors could complete the work. even really in our control. But I have to say the regulator was fine with that. So as you can imagine, we met with the regulator weekly after this had happened, and you know, they were quite reasonable in understanding that there are some things that are out of our control, but as long as you've got the work planned, and that if there are any high risk cases, that you've put mitigation in, that you've done some kind of initial work to try and reduce any risk. So I don't think it is always about setting timescales, because you won't get the contractors to be able to do that work. As long as you've got a program planned, I think it's okay.
Yeah, I was kind of thinking more on sort of programs of work for wider bits of things. I guess I was kind of thinking more about individual. That was really helpful to have that, like individual properties where you've gone in and there's a particular problem that's more low, you know, around the actual house, one property. Just we have to provide a compliance report currently around kind of whether jobs are overdue, and I'm kind of thinking, well, when does a job become overdue at house A? When is it up at B? If you're not applying a target date to some of this stuff.
Yeah. But I think you just have to, my view would be that you have to do that based on the level of work that's required and set a reasonable target for it. Because if you've got to put a whole new damp course in, or, you know, you've got to change all of the windows, or you've actually got to fix balconies that are slightly moving away, it's going to be a different timescale that you're going to give, and you know, compared to if you've got a leak coming from pipe work. So I don't think that you can, I think it has got to be individually set.
That was my kind of feeling, almost like a test of reasonableness, because it does mention a reasonable time. So that's helpful. Thank you.
I'll move us on. Thank you. Can I bring Mike in for the last question on this piece? Mike.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for that. Sorry, it's Mike Hall. I'm with Assistant Director with Islington Council. Yvonne, firstly, thank you. That's really, really interesting presentation, really useful. Just with that, I think it was Peter that asked about, who asked about the weekend work. I know at Islington we are planning to have cover for surveyors and for teams to perform take on weekend work. And regarding that, the other question that Michael just asked, there isn't that clear guidance, but it's certainly the approach we're taking is in there, remove that immediate risk, but set ourselves a reasonable timeline that we're going to complete the works, because as you said, it's so varied on what the task ahead of you is. But the key is that we feel is it's having a clear plan, and that we can produce that plan and show that plan. And if that does vary due to the type of work, you know, we can evidence why that's happened. But yes, we're at the same. We couldn't see any clear guideline on when things have to be completed.
Great. Excellent, Mark. That's very helpful. Thank you very much indeed. Yvonne, our immense thanks again for your time.
You're more than welcome. And can I just say, I'm happy for you to share the presentation with your staff if you would find that useful.
I'm sure we would.
Okay.
Brilliant.
I'll leave you all to it. Good luck.
Thank you very much indeed. Take care.
Bye.
Okay, Jay.